Gonna be changing my name after this one. I want to preface this video by saying that I don't hate this game. The Last of Us is very well made, with some hard-hitting moments, solid sound design, and home to some of the best examples of show, don't tell in a video game. There's a lot of passion flowing through this game that you can feel with every scene presented to you. The voice acting is incredible and the direction is spot on. Naughty Dog accomplished a lot and provided another defense against the video games aren't art argument. That being said, the term over-exaggerated praise has a lot of meaning here. I feel as though a lot of people have lost themselves in coming to defend this game. They see this as the pinnacle of video game stories that can only be surpassed by a sequel. This often happens with critically acclaimed games. There's always that fan base that refuses to accept any sort of critique upon their holy grail. And that's fine. Everyone is allowed to cling on to a piece of media, especially if it has some significant meaning to them. I'm not trying to take any of that away. Not gonna stop me from critiquing, though. For this video, I'll be tackling this game through story and gameplay, to a lesser extent, examining elements of each. My point isn't to deride anyone's view of The Last of Us. There is nothing wrong with loving this game. To an extent, I share those same feelings. This is about analyzing why The Last of Us is so beloved and my feelings towards it. I'll be looking at the main game only, since I view it as one complete package, although I am aware of the DLC. There will be no run-through of every level or plot point, since I believe most who have clicked on this video are already familiar with the story. I've had this topic on my mind for years and always wanted to bring up the flaws that were brought to my attention. I hope no one takes this as a personal attack, as that isn't my intention. This video is merely my thoughts on a widely beloved game that I don't see as perfect. These views were built up over 2 separate playthroughs of The Last of Us. Well, for better or, this can only make me look worse, let's get started. During the time The Last of Us was released, I was in full-on zombie mode. The Walking Dead was what pulled me into the cesspool of gore, violence, and reflective meaning of what it's like to have the future of civilization on your shoulders. I've since lost touch with the show, feeling it treaded too much familiar ground and become more of a post-apocalyptic soap opera. I didn't touch the comics, they were never really my cup of tea. I always preferred to watch events unfold on TV rather than by panel. But that show also kickstarted the public zombie craze. During the early 2010s, it felt like there was no place you couldn't go without coming across some form of zombie paraphernalia. Our society embraced any piece of media and merchandise covering the undead. Yet, there were never any drastic changes to these narratives. Formulas had been written long ago, thanks to George Romero and Danny Boyle. So what was the point in changing them? Studios could still make money by taking the same idea and placing different faces on them. This is what arguably led to fatigue of the genre for many, including myself. What was the point in experiencing the same world with identical characters dozens of times over when most concepts had been explored at that time? Sometimes there was the oddball that tried sticking out, but most of the time, things were kept relatively safe and in line with what came before it. That's the best way to describe the story of The Last of Us. Safe and in line. When you choose to write a story in a specific genre, you come across limitations. These aren't so much creative roadblocks, but guidelines to help classify the story into the genre of your choosing. Sure, there are ways to circumvent these, but doing so could cause your work to suffocate under the weight of its ambition, or reclassify your story into a completely new genre. The Last of Us knows what it is and what it wants to be. A road trip of self-discovery between 2 deeply damaged characters across a brutal wasteland. Familiar plot points and beats cover nearly every section of the story, such as the young one being the hope for everyone, a disgruntled old man who's tired of everyone's crap but hurting deeply inside, villains reflective of what the main characters could become, moral questions of whether the ends justify the means, and learning to fight through oppressive hopelessness. It all comes across as very simple, wouldn't you say? That's because it is. Co-director and writer of the game, Neil Druckmann, described his writing philosophy as simple story, complex characters. He talks about his dislike for exposition and character tropes, preferring to write honestly and taking a broader look at scenes to get to the core of what they're really about. He works to understand his characters through their actions, rather than what they choose to say, going so far as to call the game character-driven, a term I have many gripes with. A lot of writers and directors like to throw that term around like beer at a college party, believing that it makes their work come across as artsy and thought-provoking. But since every story revolves around certain characters, doesn't that make them character-driven by default? We're following individuals on a journey that brings conflict to who they are as people. Sometimes it's saving the world, other times it's getting the rent paid, while some are just about learning how to survive the day. Characters are the cornerstone of every story, and thankfully, The Last of Us has great characters. Joel may be a bit too William Money at points, Ellie can come off as a bit of a more badass Juno, but that doesn't take away from who they are. These two are so recognizable, so engaging to watch and bounce off each other, that it's easy to overlook the age-old story. They're both trying to fix each other in their own ways before realizing that the first step to improvement is their companionship. Not the most unique setup, but it works. The characters help make the story appear more deep than it really is. But what has people convinced that this story rivals the greats in cinema? One word: execution. Scenes are generally put together very well. There's a lot of thought that went into framing, character movement, and performance, providing subtext through every interaction. The directors really embraced subtlety as a pillar for their script, especially with the minimal and effective score that conveys the characters' emotions. One of my favorite scenes is where, after seeing Ellie and Joel nearly escape from bandits, we're left wondering if Joel survived his injuries. One cut to black later, and all we get is a small rabbit hopping across the frozen tundra.
This won't last very long.
This is such an excellent way to portray lost innocence and forced maturation. Ellie has been carrying the both of them for quite some time, and there's no huge expository scene where the characters' conditions are explained. Everything we need to know is in that one scene. We're left in suspense about what's happened since the events at the campus, and get delivered information through very well laid breadcrumbs. It's intense, and it makes you want to keep playing to find out what happened.
You have any antibiotics?
But execution can't mask familiar plot points and emotional beats that will make up the story. It merely gives the illusion of something new and different by giving the audience a veil of sympathetic characters to follow. The story remains as cut and dry as most other zombie tales. A shame too, since this game could have done so much more with its premise. Which brings me to my next point. A heckin' big one too. A major flaw of The Last of Us is how it doesn't take advantage of the fact that it is a video game. Game design is always at the forefront of video games, for obvious reasons. The story forms by successfully meshing elements of said game into a cohesive unit that works to tell a tale without breaking immersion. I know many don't consider story that important, since some of the highest rated games of all time are just about saving the princess and questing to stop the bad guy. But that doesn't mean it should be given zero consideration. Psychonauts blends the two together by allowing you to enter the puzzling minds of its characters. This creates an interactivity unique to the medium without sacrificing storytelling in the process. The Last of Us? Well, it tells a story for sure. Games are supposed to be this different and exciting form of entertainment that allows people to enter its world through interactivity. The Last of Us has a strong atmosphere, no doubt, but it doesn't feel like a story that belongs in a game. It's more like an overly long film that the director refused to cut anything from because they were convinced it was necessary. Does that make it bad? No. Does that make it a unique and never-before-seen thing in games? Absolutely not. You don't need excessive length to make something engaging, as has already been proven. Stories repeat throughout generations. Inevitably, you're going to come across a book that tells a similar tale, or a film borrowing concepts from another. This is when it's important to find ways to differentiate your work from others. Even the most minuscule plot twist or absurd character arc can provide a distraction for the audience. The Last of Us is a zombie story that provides very few distractions along the way. It uses the characters and environment to absorb players into a world where very few out-of-bounds events happen. The game plays up the struggle of its characters in an attempt to distract the audience from how bare bones and safe the story actually is. I mean, if you're going to make a video game, create a narrative that will only work in a video game, not one that I can check out at the Redbox for a cheaper price. Oh, but what games could topple the quality of The Last of Us' story? I hear many of you asking. Well... Shadow of the Colossus for using the environments and NPC animations to evoke visceral emotions out of players while keeping the story silent and open to interpretation. The Stanley Parable by using a narrator to lead players around multiple narrative threads that unravel the more you break the rules of the story. Braid for creating a role reversal story that plays into discovering who your character really is and questioning your motivations. What Remains of Edith Finch by using the anthology format to retell a family's history and fate so that the players may experience events that led to other relatives' deaths. Undertale for disguising the theme of forgiveness behind moral dilemmas of why killing in video games is widely accepted as okay. Gone Home for breaking the home invasion genre tropes by using exploration to piece together a story at the player's own pace. A Way Out for creating a dual perspective story that can only work in games. And Return of the Obra Dinn for using time mechanics and environmental manipulation to determine what's become of a tragedy. Whew. I've seen enough stories about humanity sucks and is our real enemy, or life sucks but maybe it's worth living, and I'm innocent and the key to restoring your sanity. Can we just agree that these tropes are played out enough in film and that games should strive to do better? Or at least something different? Games are no longer just stack the blocks or guess the right answer anymore. Narratives should be designed to take advantage of a medium's structure and formatting, rather than relying on established tropes and limitations of other art forms. So what about as a game? How does The Last of Us hold up as an action-adventure survivor horror title? Honestly, it feels like a step backwards for Naughty Dog. You have punching, shooting, grabbing, and occasionally climbing. Pretty familiar, wouldn't you say? Only now, The Last of Us has devolved into a stiff stealth game. Now, to some, this could all be supposedly intentional. Joel is getting up there in years and can no longer perform the actions he used to when he was younger. It may serve as an identifier for how old and done Joel is with just about everything, having to rely on quick movements and sharp aim to survive. But if that's true, then maybe echolocation isn't the right ability to give him. Crafting is pretty basic, but provides a lot of tense moments when you're not sure if you can find enough supplies for shivs. A death sentence if I've ever seen one. Weapon upgrades don't make as much of a difference in the grand scheme of things. Sure, you can have less recoil, a larger clip, and faster reload times, but that doesn't really amount to much when put together. At the end of the day, it's all about precise aiming or moving silently through crowds of enemies. There are plenty of ways to approach situations so you won't feel chained to one playstyle too much. Melee is surprisingly visceral and brutal. The sound effects for punches are so satisfying. The smacks delivered to another person feel more real than anything I've heard before it. The level design is also very well thought out. Each building tells a story that can be pieced together through the placement of objects and corpses. Brilliant and concise at the same time, a skill that would be carried over into Uncharted 4. Puzzles are pretty simple, all things considered. Find the generator, turn on the generator, find the ladder, climb up the ladder, help Ellie swim across to the other side, rinse and repeat. The story is very much prioritized over the gameplay, which greatly simplifies it. An argument could be made that it helps create more realism in a savage world. But I don't think that excuses how gameplay pillars were torn down from Uncharted for something more regressive. Another problem I found was the pacing. Levels are usually broken up with story beats in between. Unfortunately, I don't believe these beats are always well spaced out. Occasionally you run through countless obstacles and get a small cutscene before being thrust into another section. The problem is that such continuation can sometimes feel unnecessary and exhaust the player rather than provide emotional levity. A good example of this is after you escape the sewers with Henry and Sam. After making it through a stealth section, set piece, exploration, and infected tunnel, you now have to wade through a somewhat lengthy sniper and horde section. Up to this point, we've had enough bonding moments between the characters, especially with Joel and Henry protecting the other's child. We've gained enough knowledge and had plenty of moments where each group learns more about the other, as well as being given more reasons to trust one another. The village section after the sewer just feels like padding before the inevitable fallout. Going directly to the sewers after the radio tower would have given players the same reaction to what happens, if that was the worry. Since Naughty Dog is more concerned with telling a story, cutting the village section could have benefited the pacing greatly, in my opinion. It feels like Naughty Dog wanted to make a movie rather than a piece of interactive media. The same sin that David Cage is guilty of. And don't get me wrong, video games can tell stories just as good or even better than films. Being in control of characters in intense moments can help engage players more. However, each medium has a different structure for a reason. You can't play as actors in a film because it would ruin the narrative through line and mess with the crew's vision, whereas video games are more about defining the sequence of events through actions they choose for their characters, despite the present limitations of the game's design. That control of a digital world is what makes video games so enticing and unique from other art forms. When people use The Last of Us as an example of games coming closer to art, I can't help but think of other games that use elements of the medium more strongly to better prove this point. Ori and the Blind Forest is very illusionary, not only in its art style, but in the way the story is presented through silent characters and warm music. Journey does this as well, but creates a world where you are responsible for finding answers to your questions, either alone or with others. There are just so many better examples of artistic expression in games than one that uses the plot of The Road as its foundation, which, yes, I understand, was an inspiration. I'd like us all to take a detour for just a moment. This section doesn't have so much to do with the quality of The Last of Us, nor comparisons to other work. Rather, this is about Naughty Dog themselves. It's public knowledge that The Last of Us did not have a smooth development cycle. Crunch basically became the norm for every employee during the final stages, with co-director Bruce Straley describing it as the hardest project I've ever worked on, according to Jason Schreier's book, Blood, Sweat, and Pixels. Now, this isn't to undermine the hard work put into the game or anyone attached to it. Every job has its low points and moments of extreme pressure. But for this to happen twice in a row, the second time being on Uncharted 4, that's when it may be time to evaluate leadership ethics and conduct. People have been clamoring for The Last of Us Part 2 for years now. Very sparse information comes here and there, leaving us to believe the first unsubstantiated rumor that comes to light. And I do mean that literally. So, what could be causing this kind of silence and extended wait for the game? Perhaps the same problems with the first game and Uncharted 4 are happening all over again. This may not be my favorite studio, and I may have just spent some time critiquing one of their games, but I do care about them. I love a good story just like many others. I'm excited to see if Part 2 fixes my issues with the origin-like story of the first title. Maybe I'll even fall in line with the critical praise just like everyone else. But what I care about the most is safe working conditions and employees who don't have to sacrifice their health for the sake of a job. I'd like to stress that this is just my speculation, and I have no doubt that the talented individuals at Naughty Dog work hard to elevate their games to massive acclaim. However, that doesn't mean crunch is required. That's why I'm open to the idea of a release late next year. If it means the employees can take better care of themselves, I'd even be fine with a 2-year wait. Hell, maybe even 3. The reputation this studio has for crunch, be it mandatory or individual compulsion, doesn't sit well with me, and I believe there is room for change to keep such things from happening. Anyway, back to the reason you all came here. The Last of Us is not a bad game. That's not up for debate. In fact, I've actually gained newfound respect for it during the making of this video. The themes of self-sacrifice, finding meaning in a hopeless world, moving on from loss, how cruelty can change innocence, and survivor's guilt are all well explored and presented. I just believe that some rose-tinted goggles may be clouding judgment here and there. I enjoyed The Last of Us, but it's not my favorite game, let alone by Naughty Dog. And it certainly is not the Citizen Kane of video games. Far from it, and nowhere near as innovative in the techniques that it uses. When people compare The Last of Us to Citizen Kane, it feels like a misunderstanding. One created new cinematography techniques, such as deep focus, and using shots as a way to portray point of views, and influencing how future films were made. The other came nowhere close to breaking ground in its respective medium. To make such an audacious statement means that the art form has been influenced with near revolutionary approaches going forward. While many games and films have taken inspiration from The Last of Us, that doesn't make the narrative any more unique or groundbreaking than what's come before it. There are no leap forwards with The Last of Us, but rather entrancing standstills. It gives players the immersion they expect from video games while shrouding them in tightly knit veils. Veils I cannot be so easily blinded by. I'd like to once again express that this is solely my opinion. I'm not trying to sway anyone towards a revolt of some sort. I'm not trying to be a hipster by critiquing something popular. And I'm not trying to crush anyone's view of this game. I'm simply expressing ideas as food for thought, letting my words reach whatever masses they can as a conversation point. At the end of the day, I hope there can be some civility and understanding between us. Thank you all for watching.